2, 1. Welcome to The Sounding. We aim to provide sexual trauma survivors with a path to healing in order to tell their stories. We always start with a little disclaimer that while we are experts in our own lived experiences and here to help share that with you guys, we are not therapists, we are not doctors, we are not lawyers, and we don't know it all. So again, we're just here to share with you and hopefully build community. And let's get into today's episode.
So today's episode is going to be a little bit different. We're going to talk about one main topic and then also have a healing practice associated with it. So Shea is going to take the lead in this video.
All right. So today's episode is all about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's hard for me to talk about that without first backing up and talking about trauma. And so while you can absolutely go and Google trauma, I think it is helpful actually to Google the definition and then look at a few different ones and figure out what it really means to you. I'm currently in my Master's of Education program, and they have their own definition that they use. And then they introduce this concept that is even new to me, even though I've been studying trauma for several years at this point, which is the 3 E's of trauma. So first, I like to explain when I'm working with people that trauma is an experience that happens to you that you didn't ask for, you didn't want, and it overwhelms your capacity to cope with it. And then so we can talk about the 3 E's, which are, it's an event, so it's something that happens, you experience it, and based on how you experience it, you then have the effects of it. That, as today we're talking about, many people suffer from PTSD. So, for example, Dena and I could experience a car accident together, and our experiences, our lived experience of that said car accident can be completely different. She may not suffer from PTSD afterwards. She may be able to get back in a car and not feel activated by being in a car from the accident. But me, on the other hand, I might be diagnosed, if you will, with PTSD if for at least a month and ongoing, I'm experiencing symptoms of intrusive flashbacks, physical responses, emotional responses, looping thoughts, etc. So PTSD isn't experienced by everyone, but everyone does experience traumatic events. When it comes to PTSD, though, the reason why we have it even labeled is because it's a very real mental and behavioral disorder, and there's a history to it. So what I've found in my studies is that, and even recently, when it comes to PTSD, I just found recently, I should say, or clarify, that there are recordings of humans experiencing PTSD that dates all the way back to ancient Greek and ancient Assyria. I believe it like 13 to 600 BCE. So the point is it's not new, but the way we have actually made it a thing is relatively new. It did not enter into the DSM, the APA, the American Psychiatric Association. They have a book that is for diagnostic and statistical, I might be butchering it, but if you Google APA DSM, they have these editions, and this is where you look up mental and behavioral disorders. And in 1980 is when PTSD finally made it into the 3rd edition of the book. So we're in 2023. I'm not good at math, but that's only 43 years ago, right? I believe. Yes. That we're actually acknowledging that people have PTSD from trauma. So back to the history of it. In the 1800s, around the Industrial Revolution era, women were starting to go to their doctors and sharing their childhood traumas, a lot of it sexual trauma, and the doctors were giving them a diagnosis of what we call hysteria. They were being labeled as hysteric. So that is where we first see doctors starting to label it, right? But it's only in women, and it's women who, like I said, are coming in with these experiences in childhood that are extremely traumatic and very similar. So moving forward in time, you get to the world wars, and you have war veterans coming back and experiencing what they're starting to call shell shock, and they have a few other names for it that I'm not well versed in, but I came across them. I was like, oh, there's other words, but shell shock is a very a lot of people have heard that word. So that's the world wars. Then moving forward in time, you have the Vietnam War, and that is when you have those veterans returning, and that's when they're really taking a look at it and being like, okay, you know what? This is something here. And it's very similar to not just people who have experienced war, but it's other experiences that threaten your well-being and your life that cause PTSD. We're going to label it PTSD. So 1980, and now here we are in 2023. And what are we doing now about it in 2023? Well, there's a lot that is out there. If you, again, go to Google and you type in PTSD, you're going to find lots of different ways that you can start to heal from intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, memories, from the very real physical sensations that are uncomfortable that happen when you get activated. I don't like to use the word triggered. It triggers me. I actually even wrote a poem about it because it's so triggering. So you'll hear me say activated. And I encourage you to find language that feels trauma sensitive to you as well. We don't have to use these buzzwords just because everyone else is. So, and for me, when we're talking about what's happening to the body, it is an activation. You get PTSD more times than not. People are stuck in an activation state. Their nervous system is stuck in fight or flight. They're hyper vigilant, which we've talked about in the video. So our bodies are being activated, and what can we do about it? Lots of practices. We've talked about mindfulness. We've talked about yoga. The number one thing that you can do, we've talked about, is
breathing.
The breath. Taking a nice, big, deep breath in the heat of the moment, even though it hurts to or feels uncomfortable and scary. That breath is going to reset the nervous system. But it's not that simple when it comes to PTSD. I've even put together a program. I think I've talked about it in another video. And maybe I'll do a whole video on it.
Yes, absolutely.
I have an 8-week program where I combined mindfulness and yoga practices at a skill building level that really meets the needs of me as a survivor myself. I believe, because I've done this with survivors and they've shared their feedback, that this program meets the needs of somebody who has PTSD and wants to use mindfulness and yoga as practices. And so I'm going to say that again, it's for people who want to use that. You don't have to. You can schedule sessions with Dena and start frequency healing, right? To help with PTSD. You can bring in the practice of somatics, which is something that we're going to hopefully be sharing with you more. I'm not well versed in it, but it's my understanding of diving more into working with the body, soma, and releasing the trauma that actually gets stored there. Because that's another thing that is important to understand, is PTSD is there because trauma stores in the body if it's not released. Dr. Peter Levine is an amazing trauma expert. Check out his book, Waking the Tiger. I often reference him when explaining what that means that trauma stores in the body. And he gives, and I need to read that book again and again and again.
No, he gives a great examples of that when he talks
yeah.
about the bird that hits the window, and if you try to help it right away, it will most likely die because it stores the trauma. But if you let the trauma release naturally, then it heals from it.
Right. So we have this idea of using animals for trauma to watch them and how they react, right? We don't see animals walking around every day with PTSD is where he starts this conversation. And it's like, oh, well, how come? Well, let's observe them in a stressful and what we would look at as potentially a traumatic event for them, right? So there's this idea of two deers with bucks, right, or horns bucking at each other. And they're fighting, and then they finally separate and they shake it off and they go away and they go back to their everyday lives, right? Without PTSD potentially. So it's this practice of releasing, when we're talking about somatics, this practice of releasing that trauma. And so again, there's many ways, many different dancing, singing, group therapy, talk therapy, right? EMDR, which is actually a great segue into, we want to talk specifically about EMDR and how that can help with PTSD as our healing practice today. So again, this diagnosis of PTSD is going to mean that you're probably experiencing intrusive thoughts, feelings, and sensations. Okay, we have a body that experiences things, we have a body that feels emotional things, right? And we have a body that thinks. And that gets disrupted because that trauma is not released. So when we're looking at the healing practice of EMDR, it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And so what happens is a trained therapist will create a safe space for you to come in and, in a sense, talk through and bring up. And I say in a sense talk through because in my experience with it, and I've been doing it for almost a year now, I'm not necessarily talking through. She's guiding me in more of like a meditation and visualization. And the point is to be able to reprocess, to desensitize these memories that are on a scale of 1 to 100, probably 100 every time that they happen. They're that disruptive. That's why we get diagnosed, because it's very disruptive, right? It softens that. Each session is a goal to soften it a little through not just bringing it up and visualizing. For me, what works for me is, and I don't know if you can see my legs, but I'll do it up here. She has me tap. So I tap left to right, and my eyes are closed, and I'm tapping on my legs. And that's what's happening. Is there's a book that I need to read by the woman who discovered and created this practice of EMDR. So she goes into the science right behind what it means to have a memory come up and what it means to have the body doing left and right, activating the left and right sides of the brain, and etc. Right? It's like almost like an equation that is like a perfect chemistry mix for healing. And I'm going to tell you this right now, and I said it here first because I've never heard anyone say this, but I'm saying it here first. The yogis have been doing this. So one of my most favorite pranayamas which is a breath control practice in yoga. It's called Nadi Shodhana, which is alternate nostril breathing. And you block off one nostril while you're inhaling, and then block off and you exhale, right? So it's this left to right, 1-to-1 thing where you're breathing side to side, I should say. Same idea, potentially, right? So the point is if you're willing to and wanting to embark on your healing journey, in particular with PTSD, it's possible. It's possible to soften the everyday negotiation of yourself with PTSD. And then it also, in tandem with that, you're able to, while you're healing and softening, it also allows you quicker recoveries. Your intrusive thoughts, they're softening, but then you're also getting back to the things you really want to be thinking about quicker. And I hope that makes sense. And that is the point of healing. If we want to box it in, we want to soften and be able to recover quickly. Because if you're someone who has been diagnosed and walks every day with PTSD, again, it's this negotiation constantly, all day long, of getting back to feeling safe and supported if you even get there. So I encourage you to read more about PTSD for yourself if it's something that you haven't been diagnosed with and you're thinking you may have experienced. I also encourage you to look into EMDR. It is a really amazing gift to give yourself if it sounds like something for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to say that my experience with PTSD, I was diagnosed 20 years ago based on my traumatic childhood, which at the time I didn't even know was a thing. So then I became, someone that had PTSD. So I did a lot of the things that Shea has already talked about, and I can tell you that I no longer live in a body that reacts. It's very settled. My nervous system is settled, and so this work that we're discussing regularly, it works if you are willing to dive deep and really face yourself and get the help that you need, because it's out there.
Yeah, and I don't want to make promises that you will never have.
Sure.
Your responses you'll be balanced all the way through. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm offering is this, again, idea of softening and being able to recover quickly, and this awareness and more control over how you want to respond.
Absolutely. So beautiful. I love it. Yeah. I hope you learned a lot. Please feel free to look all those things up. Like, subscribe, share, so that we can help heal the collective. That's our purpose here. And we want you to be on this journey with us as survivors. Because I
just want to make sure you comment too.
Comment, yes.
Always, we want your feedback.
Absolutely.
We're only going off of things that have come up in our conversations that we are like, we should talk about this with the people. We should talk about that. We need to hear from you too. So
Absolutely.
Leave us a comment. We want to hear from you.
Yes, thank you.
Because
when survivors speak,
the silence ends. Thank you.